In the spring of 1565, one of the most powerful empires in the world set its sights on a small rocky island in the middle of the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents and commanded vast armies, immense wealth, and a formidable navy. Opposing it was a tiny Christian outpost defended by a few hundred warrior monks, local militia, and an aging Grand Master already in his 70s. Yet, this was no ordinary island. For centuries, Malta had stood at the crossroads of empires. Phoenicians, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, and Normans had all recognised its value. Whoever controlled Malta possessed a strategic key to the central Mediterranean, and in the 16th century, 2 rival worlds were preparing to fight over it. The clash that followed would become one of the most famous sieges in military history. It would pit seasoned commanders against each other, test the limits of human endurance, and force ordinary men and women to confront an existential threat. This is the story of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Great Siege of 1565.
This is the History of the World podcast. Written and presented by Chris Hasler.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
This summer, soccer is here. And so are the watch parties. And Uber Eats has your game day essentials covered. Everything you need to keep your crowd happy. Delivered straight to your door. Get wings, pizza, chips, dips, fresh ingredients, and more. Keep the soccer going and all your game day essentials flowing. Order in so you can lock in for the games. Only on Uber Eats for a limited time.
Volume 5, The Expansionist World. Episode 4, The Great Siege of Malta. Malta is an island country in the central Mediterranean Sea, south of Sicily. The Maltese archipelago consists of 3 inhabited islands and 2 uninhabited islets. The fact that we have not discussed Malta at all during this podcast is no way an indication that it has an uninteresting history. Quite the contrary. Right from 7,000 years ago, the island became inhabited and it would come to boast some of the oldest megalithic temples anywhere in the world, predating Stonehenge in England and the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. So let's not miss out on the opportunity to take a whistle-stop tour of the entire history of Malta up to the Great Siege of Malta, which took place in the year 1565. Malta is believed to have been settled sometime during the 6th millennium BCE, when Neolithic farmers from Sicily inhabited the islands. These humans are referred to as the Gigantea temple builders because their descendants would build some of the most astonishing buildings in world history. The oldest known monumental temple complex in the world was built at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey during the 10th and 9th millenniums BCE, but beyond that, the Gigantea temple complex rivals other wonderful Stone Age buildings in terms of being among the earliest known. Some of the stones used weigh up to 50 tons, and how they could have been moved into position is a mystery to modern Maltese people, so much so that they are now referred to as the Gigantea temples, as it was assumed that they could have only been built by giants. It may have been that this temple site was built by the farming community to encourage fruitful crop yields. Animal bones suggest ritual sacrifice, and the presence of Mother Goddess figurines points towards some kind of fertility worship, concepts which we explored closely in our prehistoric volume of this podcast. This site on the island of Gozo has now become a tourist attraction. Up until the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, around 30 megalithic temples had been constructed. But after this point in history, things stopped abruptly, and this created a mystery, as the question is asked, what happened to the Gigantea temple builders? People who appear in Malta after the middle of the 3rd millennium appeared to be culturally and genetically different to the Gigantea temple builders, which strongly suggests a displacement or a replacement of peoples. However, there is no sign of an invasion or mass disease or of widespread famine, so it could be that the Gigantea temple builders simply died out gradually or simply abandoned the islands. An abandonment could be realistic, as archaeologists have detected a decline in the soil quality of the islands and a significant deforestation. Those who stayed on the islands would have found survival more difficult than their ancestors. However, DNA research has detected a high degree of inbreeding, with evidence of second-degree relative parents, which means that an individual's parents could be related to each other as uncle and niece or aunt and nephew, for example. This results in individuals having reduced resilience and the society as a whole having a greater fragility. So, although we don't know exactly why there was a sudden alteration in human history during this time, there are pointers which could help us to have an educated guess of the reasons. It is not until around 800 BCE that a true contemporary history of Malta emerged with the arrival of the Phoenicians, a seafaring peoples from the Levant who famously settled Carthage in North Africa and whose descendants in this city became known to history as the Carthaginians, whose stories we told during the ancient and classical volumes of this podcast. There was definitely human activity in Malta between the disappearance of the Gigantea temple builders and the arrival of the Phoenicians. They were a Bronze Age peoples who introduced new ceramics and metallurgy and constructors of fortified settlements. They appeared to have strong links with Sicily, their nearest large landmass in the Mediterranean. Malta's position in the Mediterranean gave it great strategic value. It was a great stop-off point for the sea journey between Sicily and North Africa, and its geography meant that it could be used with relative ease because of its natural harbours. The age of temple and monument building had passed, but there is still evidence that small Bronze Age village societies existed. If you remember our story of the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, you will remember that although the Phoenicians were a major naval trading society of the Mediterranean in the early centuries of the 1st millennium BCE, after they had established Carthage, Phoenician societies of the Levant faded away and Carthaginian society flourished. Malta gradually became part of the Carthaginian sphere of influence. As the centuries of the 1st millennium passed by, a rival to the Carthaginians emerged on the Italian peninsula. They were the Romans, and the Romans' insatiable desire for power led to an inevitable clash with the dominant Carthaginians. This led to the Punic Wars between the Carthaginians and the Romans from the 3rd century BCE. During the First Punic War, the Romans stopped in Malta on their way to North Africa back to the Italian peninsula. The Romans took as much loot as possible from Malta and destroyed everything else. It would not be until the later Second Punic War that the Romans would take full control of Malta. From 218 BCE onwards, Malta fell firmly under Roman control. With the threat of the Carthaginians extinguished, Malta flourished with its trade of grain, olive oil and textiles. In the book of Acts in the New Testament of the Bible, we learn of how Paul the Apostle was on a ship that was carried off course by storms and ended up beached at Melite, a place that is believed to be Malta. Paul spent some time on Malta healing the unwell before heading off for Rome. It is suggested that this is the period which led to Malta's Christianization. Politically, Malta was considered part of the Sicilian sphere, but at the period of the end of Western Roman rule in Europe, the Vandals and the Ostrogoths attempted to extend their influence over the Maltese islands. The periods of their influence were quite brief and never fully enforced. After all, there were bigger prizes to fight for in Europe when it came to land. So ultimately, Malta would become the property of the Byzantine Empire, the successor state to the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantines left a definite influence on Malta's culture and architecture, as well as fortifying the islands. As the Byzantine Empire's Mediterranean influence weakened, an Arab people called the Aghlabids conquered the island in the year 870. This particular conquest resonates to this very day, with Malta having a national identity and language quite unique from their Sicilian neighbours. Arabic would influence the modern language spoken on the islands, and is the foundation for the modern Semitic Maltese language. And although Italian languages have had a major influence on the Maltese language, they are quite distinct. Maltese is the only Semitic language that is officially written in the Latin alphabet. The Arabs would introduce new irrigation techniques that would change the nature of agriculture in Malta. In 1091, Roger I of Sicily led a Norman expedition that brought Malta back into the Christian sphere of influence after a couple of centuries under Islamic influence. Malta would then officially be a part of the Kingdom of Sicily, and its strategically important location meant that it had value to whoever was fortunate enough to control it. The Kingdom of Sicily passed from the Normans to the Hohenstaufen dynasty of the Swabians. Then after the fall of the Hohenstaufens, it passed to Angevins. The Spanish crown of Aragon took Sicily from the Angevins, and so Sicily and Malta would become possessions of the unified Spanish monarchy. The Knights Hospitaller. The origin of the Knights Hospitaller was explained during our episodes on the Crusades during the Medieval World volume of the podcast. The original Knights Hospitallers were not a military order. Instead, they were Benedictine monks who operated a hospital founded by merchants from Amalfi and for Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem. The Hospitallers were referred to as the Order of St. John, in dedication to St. John the Baptist. In 1113, Pope Pascal II admired the work of the Hospitallers and wanted to protect it from the interference of local bishops, nobles, and the rulers of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and so he granted it papal protection and independence from any secular authority or local church council, and thereby allowing them the right to declare their own Grand Master. It soon became clear to the Hospitallers that they would need to protect their order, and so they would look to recruit knights into their order to protect the pilgrims. The ability of the order to be able to attract knights into their ranks was thanks to the charitable donations that the Hospitallers received, giving them financial influence. The fact that the Hospitallers had recruited respected knights into their ranks gave them military value, and soon it was made clear that not only was the order in place to care for the sick, but also in place to help to defend the Holy Land. The Knights Hospitallers became an independent military order, willing to stand alongside the royal armies of the Holy Land to defend it against Muslim invasion. The knights themselves were bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience as per their monastic requirements. The Hospitallers were also considered to be masters of fortification, and Crac des Chevaliers in modern-day Syria was considered nearly impregnable. More hospitals were also built in Outremer. Jerusalem fell to Muslims reclaiming their lost territory in the late 12th century, so the Hospitallers relocated to Acre, which itself fell in the late 13th century as the Crusader states collapsed. The Hospitallers initially withdrew to Cyprus, but this was no permanent refuge. Cyprus was its own kingdom, and the Hospitallers would have to obey the king. With the Knights Templar also in refuge there, Cyprus was becoming a political powder keg. The Hospitallers would not be able to enjoy political independence on Cyprus, so they decided to move to a new home on the island of Rhodes, which they seized from the Byzantine Empire sometime around 1310. We can commonly refer to the island as Hospitaller Rhodes from this date. Now island-bound, the Hospitallers developed a naval force. This was just as well because the Muslim forces, including the emerging Ottomans, would develop their own naval capabilities. With the Ottomans trying to obtain influence of the shipping lanes of the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as the Mamluks of Egypt, the Hospitallers would actively defend what they regarded as Christian waterways and be referred to as the Corsairs of Christendom. The Ottomans would regard the Hospitallers as an inconvenience to their expansionist ambitions. The Ottoman Empire. For those of you following the podcast episode by episode, you will now be very familiar with the story of the initial centuries of the Ottoman Empire. The name Ottoman is derived from the minor Turkic warlord called Osman, who ruled a small territory in Anatolia on the edge of the Byzantine Empire, in the region of Suat, at the turn of the 14th century. With their Ghazi spirit, that is the spirit of holy warriors, they would have a powerful ideological drive for expansion, both against the Byzantines and rival neighbouring Turkish principalities. The Ottoman Empire expanded rapidly during the 14th century under Orhan and Murad I. They captured Bursa and turned it into their first major capital city. Then the Ottomans crossed into Europe via the Dardanelles. Once in Europe, the Ottomans conquered Adrianople and renamed it Edirne, giving them an important strategic capital in Europe. From here, they could effectively kidnap Christian boys, convert them to Islam, and train them to become an elite military infantry called the Janissaries. Now in Europe, the Ottomans could weaken Balkan resistance at the Battle of Kosovo, where they could impose their authority over the Serbs and establish themselves as a major presence in the Balkans. 7 years later, at the end of the 14th century, a large Crusader coalition led by King Sigismund of Hungary, which included the Knights Hospitaller, besieged Nicopolis, but a large Ottoman army crushed the Crusaders and paved the way for the Ottomans to pressurise what remained of the Byzantine Empire. It was only the rise of the Timurids in Asia that distracted the Ottomans from their own ambitions in Europe and delayed any further expansion during the early 15th century. Thankfully for the Ottomans, they would overcome the hardship of a major military defeat against the Timurids and the subsequent civil war and rebuild their empire. They restored their unity and resumed their expansion. This was bad news for their neighbours, and particularly the Byzantines of Constantinople, who had avoided total conquest as a consequence of the Ottoman struggles. It would be under Sultan Mehmed II that the Ottomans finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, an event which marked the end of the Byzantine Empire. The conquest of Constantinople took the Ottomans into a new era in their development. Now they would have some degree of control of the trade routes between Europe and Asia, and it would require some degree of naval expertise to be able to contend with the maritime trade expertise of such polities as the Venetians to truly dominate the eastern Mediterranean. Land expansion was also a priority as the Ottomans looked to expand further in the Middle East, North Africa and Central Europe. Much of the Turkish-speaking world was unified under their rule. In the 16th century, under Sultan Selim I, the Ottomans conquered the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, also the new spiritual home of the Abbasid Caliphate after it had been destroyed in Baghdad by the Mongols in the early 13th century. With this, Selim assumed the title of Caliph, making him the spiritual leader of the Muslim world. With this came control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Jean Parisot de Valette. Jean Parisot de Valette was a descendant of Fortuné de Valette, a 12th century noble and crusader who participated in the Third Crusade alongside King Philip II of France. Jean's grandfather, Gaillard de Morlon Valette, was a king's orderly. In other words, a knight assigned to the French king's personal service. Jean's father was Guillaume de la Valette Cornusson, a Chevalier de France, a knight formally recognised by the King of France. So Jean's lineage had a strong link to knights from the Crusader era and also to the crown of France. Jean himself was born in 1495 in the family fiefdom of Parisot in southern France. At the age of 20, he decided to join the Knights Hospitaller when they were on the island of Rhodes. So he left France and joined the Langue de Provence division of the Hospitallers, which included others who originated from the Provençal-speaking regions of southern France. As a young knight, Valette gained a reputation for being a capable and courageous soldier. He was noted for his strict discipline, religious devotion, and his serious temperament. He learned the realities of frontier warfare in naval combat, siege defence, and the constant tension of living under the threat of the Ottomans. Rhodes was an Ottoman target, so Valette would soon be exposed to the real responsibilities of a young knight. The Ottomans had attempted to assault Hospitaller Rhodes during the late 15th century, but were ultimately unsuccessful. The Ottomans returned in 1522 while Valette was there. Sources declare that he fought with distinction against the Ottomans during this siege, but ultimately the Ottomans, led by Sultan Selim's son, Suleiman the Magnificent, forced the knights to abandon Rhodes after over 200 years there. During the brutal 6-month siege, Valette survived bombardment and close quarters combat, so the ultimate loss must have been a bitter pill to swallow. The Hospitallers had no permanent home, so Valette would have to transition to a somewhat unsettled way of life. It is during this period that Valette would have to demonstrate his naval capabilities as the order turned to naval warfare against the Ottomans. Valette would be a capable commander, but notably continued his austere monastic personal habits as was proper for the Hospitallers' order. By 1530, the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, saw value in befriending the very capable Hospitallers within his own challenges with the Ottomans. So he would grant them a new home on Malta as long as they agreed to defend the central Mediterranean on behalf of Charles V. Malta was no Rhodes, but the knights agreed and settled there. Their show of fealty to Charles V was a symbolic donation of a well-trained Maltese peregrine falcon each year. The story of John Parisot de Valette often reads like that of the ideal Hospitaller knight, courageous, disciplined, and deeply devout. However, records also showed that he was punished by the order in 1538 for attacking another man. He was sent to the old prison of Gozo on the second largest island of the Maltese archipelago for 4 months. 3 years later, while commanding the galley San Giovanni in battle against Barbary corsairs from North Africa, he was captured and used as a galley slave for a year, forced to row Ottoman galleys alongside other Christian sailors. It was humiliating and physically punishing, but eventually Valette was ransomed back to the Hospitallers who paid for his release. All of these experiences helped form the Valette of later life. Jean Parisot de Valette was not known for charm and diplomacy, but his experiences had hardened him, and his belief and devotion to the order's mission was absolute. He steadily rose through the ranks of the Hospitallers. He was sent to command the isolated and dangerous North African outpost of Tripoli, and demonstrated his mastery of fortification and discipline. He would then be given the responsibility of the Captain General of the galleys, a most prestigious military post which reported directly to the order's Grand Master and commanded and prepared the galley fleet. This job was reserved for the most capable and trusted knights, of which Valette was one. By 1557, the Grand Master Claude de la Sangle fell ill, and Valette served as his lieutenant until de la Sangle's passing, at which point Valette was unanimously elected Grand Master, the highest role in the order. It was going to be the ultimate test for the man now in his 60s, with Malta in a vulnerable position under threat from the never more powerful Ottomans under their great leader Suleiman the Magnificent. Valette did not care for political games. He was a man focused on what was necessary: restoring disciplined order to the Hospitallers, fortifying Malta, and striking up meaningful alliance in Christendom. Ottoman Corsairs. Ottoman corsairs in the mid-16th century were naval raiders sponsored by the Ottoman Empire to aid Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean. They were an essential part of the Ottoman naval force. Without Ottoman direction, these corsairs would have likely been expert pirates of the Mediterranean, but the Ottomans used their ruthless maritime existence to their advantage. The Ottoman Empire knew that they could not necessarily fully trust them, but in a mutually beneficial relationship, they could be controlled. In the early 16th century, a lesbian man called Hayreddin Barbarossa became an archetypal corsair. Lesbos was an island controlled by the Ottomans, so Barbarossa was born into the Ottoman Empire. As an Ottoman corsair, he raided Christian ships in the Mediterranean and established a base at Algiers in North Africa, creating what is described as a corsair state. Barbarossa's abilities led to the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent appointing him the Capitan Pasha, which was the highest naval rank in the Ottoman Empire. One of Barbarossa's protégés was a man called Turgut Reis, a man referred to in Western history as Dragut. Barbarossa prized Dragut and admired him for his exceptional bravery. When Dragut was captured by the Genoese and used as a galley slave much in the same way as Valette had been, Barbarossa made repeated attempts to ransom him, such was his value. Barbarossa died in 1546 and left behind a legacy of 3 corsair states at Algiers, Tunis and Tripoli. Dragut's capture and enslavement only served to fuel his hatred for the Hospitallers, who were a vital element of the action. Like Valette, Dragut was a highly capable naval commander with a determination to fight against Christian opponents, which led to his recognition by Suleiman the Magnificent and his conscription as a senior and trusted Ottoman commander. Sources strongly suggest that Dragut crossed paths with Valette during the course of their respective naval careers, and there could have been a begrudging respect between the two men on opposite sides of the ideological spectrum. Dragut and Valette were the deadliest of enemies, but with a shared past of galley slave captivity and naval brilliance. The commander of the Ottoman army was Kuzul Ahmedli Mustafa Pasha, a man from the ruling dynasty of the Beylik of Kandar, an area of the Ottoman Empire on the Black Sea coast of Anatolia. Mustafa was an experienced commander in his late 60s, and he was known for his cold, ruthless discipline. He was the Grand Vizier and one of Sultan Suleiman's most trusted generals. Piali Pasha was considerably younger than Mustafa, and he was the commander of the Ottoman fleet. It is worth noting that the name Pasha is actually a name for a high-ranking individual, so despite all of the commanders all being called Pasha, they are not related to each other in any way. Piali's background was actually of Hungarian or Croatian origin, and during the Battle of Mohacs, where Suleiman the Magnificent scored a conclusive victory against the Hungarians, Piali was captured. He was only a child, and much like the Janissaries, he was converted to Islam and subjected to elite training. Upon becoming the equivalent of a Grand Admiral, he captured the important islands of Elba and Corsica for the Ottomans, proving his elite capabilities. In 1560, a Christian coalition which included the Knights Hospitaller attempted to retake Tripoli, which, as we know, was captured by Dragut 9 years earlier, but it was Piali's swift and decisive action as the fleet commander which saw the Ottomans ultimately successful in repelling this attempt at the Battle of Djerba. Dragut had supported Piali during this campaign. The governor of Algiers and a senior corsair commander was known as Hassan Pasha. Hassan was of the same generation as Piali, who were in turn much younger than Mustafa, and considerably younger than Dragut. But all of them were of an advanced and experienced age by the time of the battle in question. It is said that Hassan was the son of the legendary corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa. Prelude to the battle. It may be awkward to describe the geography of the scene. Initially, we have to think about modern Malta and its capital city of Valletta facing northwest on a peninsula called the Shiberis Peninsula. At the time and before the establishment of Valletta, the peninsula was simply occupied by Fort St. Elmo at its tip. Fort St. Elmo guarded the entrance into the Grand Harbour to the peninsula's south. On the opposite side of the harbour is another piece of headland where Fort Ricasoli is built, but at the time of the siege no fortification was built. Instead, on the south side, the fortifications were actually built inside the harbour on small, outstretched pieces of land. Firstly, Fort St. Angelo, and then Fort St. Michael. So, although on the north side of the Grand Harbour, the Chiberus Peninsula extended out towards the open seas, on the south side, pieces of land stretched into the harbour itself, like toes extending from a foot. Those fortifications that we have already spoken of were fortified by the Hospitallers since their occupation of Malta in their 30-plus years on the island. The activities of the Knights in the Mediterranean Sea against Ottoman shipping during their time on Malta intensified and in turn infuriated Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent to the point of seeing Malta as a problem that needed to be dealt with. It also became clear that Malta's strategic value was increasing with its establishment as a defensible settlement, making it essential for controlling Mediterranean shipping more than ever. If the Ottomans controlled Malta, there would be a shift in the balance of power. In 1564, the Hospitallers captured a massive Ottoman galleon, Sultana, on the Ionian Sea. The galleon carried luxury goods worth around 80,000 ducats. The ducat was a high-purity gold coin widely used across Europe at the time. The governors of Alexandria and Cairo were on board, as was a former nurse of Suleiman's daughter. There was outrage and Suleiman was pushed to act. Not only could Suleiman send a clear message to the Hospitallers that their actions would not go unpunished, but he could gain control of Malta, which would give him a doorway to a potential attack on Sicily and eventually Rome, which would send a clear message to Christendom that Islam was the dominant ideology. The Knights Hospitallers Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette had already spent a lot of energy in bolstering the fortifications of Malta since his appointment as Grand Master in 1557. Valette knew an attack was likely. Now it was the winter, late in 1564, and Suleiman had the shipyards in Constantinople working tirelessly to prepare 200 ships for the transport of tens of thousands of soldiers and the elite janissaries. Piali Pasha would command the fleet, while Mustafa Pasha would command the troops. What the Ottomans may not have realised is that Valette also operated one of the most effective intelligence agencies in Europe at the time. Spies from within the shipyards were able to relay back to him exactly what was going on, so Valette would be able to start preparations for Malta's defence. He concentrated efforts on the defensibility of the forts St. Elmo, St. Angelo and St. Michael. He ordered every scrap of grain in the Maltese countryside to be harvested so that resources were in Maltese possession and not available to the invading Ottomans. All wells in the Maltese countryside were deliberately poisoned to deny fresh water to the invaders. Letters were dispatched to Pope Pius IV and King Philip II of Spain. The reaction from their powerful Christian allies was not impressive, with Philip aware that Malta was not his sole priority. Some knights from the continent did arrive before the Ottoman fleet advanced and enforced a naval blockade on the island. Only a few hundred knights leading a few thousand soldiers and mercenaries were ready to defend Malta by May 1565, the month of the Ottoman arrival. On the morning of the 18th of May, lookouts spotted the Ottoman fleet on the horizon. And so the frantic ringing of the island's church bells signalled that every man, woman and child should now flee to the relative safety of the island's stone fortifications. The Great Siege of Malta. After a 3-week voyage from Constantinople, the Ottoman fleet arrived at Marsashlock Bay at the southeast corner of Malta. Troops stood on Maltese soil unopposed and began setting up camps. The Ottoman army commander, Mustafa Pasha, had ambitions of taking the Maltese capital of Mdina, but the fleet admiral, Piali Pasha, was much more concerned about securing a safe harbour for his fleet. So it was decided that the Ottomans should attack Fort St. Elmo in order to provide the safe anchorage that Piali was looking for. It was up to Valette to defend Fort St. Elmo and keep the Ottoman fleet in the open sea, and if Valette could prolong its capture, then it would buy him more time to further reinforce other forts and settlements and prepare for an all-out battle. The Ottomans began to bombard Fort St. Elmo from the sea relentlessly, hoping that the fort would fall within a few days. It did not. Fortunately for the Ottomans, the Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had had the foresight to know that the Knights could present a stubborn challenge, and so he asked the wise old man Dragut to travel to Malta to oversee the operation. When Dragut arrived, he immediately noticed that the strategy needed to be improved, so he focused the bombardment at more vulnerable parts of the fort and ramped up the land invasion. Already the Ottomans had wasted a lot of time with the wrong strategy, with nearly 2 weeks of indecisiveness and bad decisions. Valette had done enough to ensure that Fort St. Elmo did not fall easily, and so a job that the Ottomans expected to take a few days had actually taken a few weeks. The constant bombardment had reduced the fort to rubble, and with Ottoman infantry also trying to capture the fort in waves, casualties mounted heavily on both sides. On the 18th of June, a cannonball fired from Fort St. Angelo sent shattered stone fragments flying through the air after hitting its target. The elderly Dragut was struck by this debris, and he was carried away to his command tent. Dragut drifted in and out of consciousness for several days, while Ottoman commanders remained tight-lipped about Dragut's condition. Mustafa Pasha was enraged by the Ottoman losses, so much so that he decapitated the bodies of knights and floated them across the Grand Harbour on crosses. So in turn, Valette decapitated his Ottoman prisoners and used their heads as cannonballs. On the 23rd of June, the Ottomans finally breached the walls of the fort and slaughtered every last man inside. And it was also on this day that Dragut died, aged around 80 years old. Several thousand Ottoman soldiers, including many elite janissaries, had been sacrificed for the cause which had been prolonged by fierce Hospitaller resistance. And because of Valette's refusal to surrender the fort, despite pressure to abandon it, the Hospitallers were able to fortify other areas of Malta. The fall of the fort meant that Piali Pasha could use Marsamshet harbour to the north of the Shiberas Peninsula to bring his fleet in from the open waters. With Fort St. Elmo now destroyed, the Ottomans turned their attention to the 2 major forts in the Grand Harbour, Fort St. Angelo and Fort St. Michael. Fort St. Angelo at the headland on the Vittoriosa Peninsula, one of the toes or fingers extending out into the Grand Harbour, protected the fortified city of Birgu, while Fort St. Michael protected the city of Singleia on the Isla Peninsula, located behind the Vitoriosa Peninsula. Valette had strengthened the two forts and built a floating bridge on the narrow strip of water separating the two peninsulas to enable quick communication and transfer of people and weapons between the two forts. Civilians were encouraged to support the defence by doing whatever they could, including tasks such as running weapons across the temporary bridge. For the population of Malta, this was total war and an existential threat. The Ottomans bombarded both fortified cities, but the defenders held firm, and once again many casualties were felt on both sides. The assault lasted throughout July and into August. Hidden artillery and chains that had been prepared for this assault helped the Hospitallers to defend the cities and scatter the attacking Ottoman fleet. The Ottomans would also dig tunnels to try to get underneath the fortifications in order to plant explosives. The Hospitallers were wise to this and would dig their own tunnels in order to detect Ottoman mining and fight the Ottoman miners in the total darkness of the tunnels. Further explosives were used by the defenders when Ottoman soldiers attempted to breach the fortifications on foot, and the defenders used shells packed with gunpowder and debris and lit a short burning fuse before rolling the shell down the outside of the forts onto the unsuspecting Ottomans. These two strategies are referred to as countermining and rolling bombs. The North African corsair Hassan Pasha had joined the Ottoman cause with his own fleet and troops at the beginning of the siege, and in July Hassan launched a major offensive against Singleia. Thanks once again to the foresight and strategy of Valette and the Knights Hospitallers, hidden gun positions close to the waterline hit the Ottoman landing craft at point-blank range. Alongside other aforementioned strategies, the Hospitallers successfully defended Singleia from the sea and land offensive. By August, it was obvious that the Ottoman siege of Malta had largely been disastrous in terms of the amount of time and resource spent. Maybe sometime on or after the date of the 7th of August, the Ottomans launched one of the largest coordinated assaults of the siege, with a simultaneous attack on both Birgu and Singleia from multiple directions. The native population fought for their lives. Even Jean Parisot de Valette, at over 70 years of age, was personally involved in the fighting, with sword in hand. Hours of brutal close combat took place. The defenders held firm, absorbing wave after wave of attacks. The Knights were severely depleted by this stage, with their thousands now down to hundreds. It should now only be a matter of time before Ottoman victory. The intense summer sun was taking its toll, however. Poor sanitation and dwindling resources led to disease through the Ottoman camps, and with low supplies of food and gunpowder, although the Ottomans had the upper hand, time was against them, and every day of Hospitaller resistance was a bitter blow for the Ottomans to absorb. The Ottomans just could not finish the job, with Hospitallers using their supply lines to rebuild fortifications as quickly as the Ottomans were attacking them. With the Ottomans throwing so much at the sea forts, the capital city of Mdina remained in Christian hands. Corpses lay everywhere, and dysentery rampaged through the Ottoman camps. Supplies were either low in quantity or low in quality, including water. The Ottoman camps became pits of sickness. Then, in September, a relief force from Sicily, led by Don Garcia de Toledo, arrived. Around 8,000 Spanish and Italian veterans landed on Malta. Vital resources for the defenders were provided, which proved to be a vital boost in a battle that appeared to have reached a stalemate. This relief force was extremely late to the battle, and had it arrived earlier, much in the way of long-term suffering on Malta could have been avoided. But at least it did arrive. Better late than never. The Ottomans may have been expecting many more Christian troops to arrive, but there was still enough of them to make a significant difference. The relief force landed at the north of the island of Malta, and the Ottoman commanders could not decide what to do. Mustafa Pasha opted to take on this relief force as it was smaller than he initially anticipated. But when the Spanish troops charged the exhausted Ottomans, the Ottomans were driven into the sea. With no resources and no quick conclusion in sight, Mustafa Pasha made the painful decision to abandon the siege. The Ottomans began to dismantle their camps and load their ships. The haste of the retreat meant that siege equipment brought to Maltese shores was abandoned. Late summer storms and harassment from the relief force caused the retreat to be a shameful scene. By late September, the Ottoman fleet had left Maltese waters. After 4 months of battle, the Hospitallers had resisted the siege. A large portion of the knights and many Maltese civilians and soldiers had been killed. The cities of Birgu and Singleia had been heavily damaged, but the Ottomans had ultimately failed. Aftermath. The Ottomans were shamed by the defeat, but the Knights Hospitaller enjoyed the respect of Christendom. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was shocked, angry, and deeply disappointed with the outcome at Malta. Malta was expected to fall quickly, and the Ottoman failure to win at all was an embarrassment. However, Suleiman did not execute his commanders, who would go on to serve the Ottomans after Suleiman's death just 1 year after the Great Siege of Malta at the age of 71. The reputations of Mustafa Pasha, Piali Pasha and Hassan Pasha had been damaged by the loss. The arguments between Mustafa and Piali about the strategy had undoubtedly contributed to the misfortune of the Ottomans, and it could be very likely that they both blamed each other for the failure. Despite the Ottoman failure at Malta, there were other concerns in the Mediterranean that required the undoubted expertise and experience of both Mustafa and Piali. Therefore, they both continued to serve in a very important capacity for the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa served as Grand Vizier for a short period before his own death in the early 1570s. Piali played an important role in the War of Cyprus in the early 1570s before his own death in around 1578. Hassan Pasha returned to his post in Algiers. As with Mustafa, it can be difficult to track Hassan's exact activity due to the fact that there appears to be multiple individuals known as Hassan Pasha in the historical records. It appears very likely that Hassan still served the Ottoman Empire as a corsair against Christian aggression and as a naval commander. Sources suggest that he died around 1572 in Constantinople and was buried next to his father, Hayreddin Barbarossa. Jean Parisot de Valette, the Grand Master of the Knights Hospitaller, was celebrated as one of Europe's greatest heroes. Tributes, money, and jewels poured in from many monarchs in Europe. Pope Pius IV offered Valette a cardinal's hat, and although this was a great honour, the appointment would have taken him away from his military command, something which he treasured. Valette knew that although the Hospitallers had been successful, they needed to prepare for future invasions. So Valette laid the foundation stone for a new fortified capital city on the Shiberis Peninsula, where Fort St. Elmo had stood. Sadly, Valette would not see the outcome of the construction, as he died in 1568 at the age of 72. But the city would be named Valletta in his honour, and is the modern Maltese capital city. Thanks to the donations made from around Europe, Malta became a world-class fortress. It became a centre of art, medicine and architecture. The Knights would continue to harass Ottoman and Barbary corsair activity, and it would not be until 1798 that the Hospitallers would be expelled from Malta by the French general Napoleon Bonaparte. As for the Ottomans, they remained a dominant naval power, but the siege exposed vulnerabilities in their siege tactics and logistics. The aura of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered, and Christian resistance had been encouraged. The defeat effectively ended serious Ottoman hopes of using Malta as a stepping stone for an invasion of Sicily and southern Italy. With the death of their great Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the year after Malta, the Ottomans had to renew their focus, something that we will explore in our next episode.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Thank you very much for listening to this, the next episode of the History of the World podcast, Volume 5, on the Great Siege of Malta. It was a long one. I must admit, it did go on and on. However, it was so interesting. I couldn't get away from my fascination on this topic, the Turkish corsairs. Really fascinating to discover all these different characters and this wonderful island group, this archipelago in the Mediterranean, and how time and time again has become the backdrop for some of the most intense historical battles. And once again, here it is, Malta and the Knights Hospitaller, this incredible organisation, this quite unique organisation, and what it became. So I can't apologise really, because I just found the subject matter absolutely fascinating. I hope you enjoyed it too. I just would like to say now, don't forget to listen to the sister podcast to the History of the World podcast. It's called History of the World Podcast Timelines. And we've currently published 6 episodes. The 7th episode is coming, and we're discovering each of the UK. Sorry, that's where I'm from. We're discovering each of the US presidents, and this weekend's episode will be about Andrew Jackson, a real turning point in the presidency, and what we look at, what we regard as the presidency, and what we regard as American party politics. This is a really fascinating time in the history of America. So please, please, please do go and investigate the History of the World podcast Timelines. It's available everywhere you listen to your podcasts. Now, some of you may be aware that we're also updating some of our older podcasts. So at the moment, Volume 1 is going through a bit of a revamp. And I think with a chronological history such as this, episodes can very quickly go out of date. So if we can maybe republish and update Volume 1, the science in this area is constantly updating our knowledge and the story of our past, and it's very important that maybe we acknowledge that and bring it up to date. And also, let's be honest about it. When back in 2018, when the podcast started, some of the qualities of the podcast hadn't quite been refined like they are today. And so it gives us an opportunity maybe to improve the sound quality and some of the grammar and some of the flow of the podcast episodes. So we're going back and re-recording some of them. Episode 1 has already been republished. But for those of you who are subscribers through Spotify, those of you who pay just, I think it's $2.99 a month, you can listen to the entire back catalogue, whether it was recorded, re-recorded, and some of the exclusive content that was released a few years back between main episodes. So there's some, maybe about 24 hidden episodes that are there to be discovered if you're a subscriber. As ever, if you just want to support the podcast, the entire project, if you want to support the History of the World podcast or the History of the World podcast timelines, then do please consider making a monthly contribution via Patreon. You can find the link if you go to the History of the World podcast.com website. And there you can also find the beginnings of an index. So a bit like if we were publishing a book, it's handy maybe to have an index. And so with the republishing of some of the episodes now, we're trying to create an updated index. Hopefully that will go well and you can have a comprehensive guide. If you're trying to pinpoint particular individuals or topics, you can actually find out which episode it was discussed in. So go and have a look, go and explore the website, historyoftheworldpodcast.com. Right, let's see if we can discover one or two messages that have been sent to the History of the World podcast this year. Here's one from Michael James Ellis Bennett that says, "Hi Chris, my name is Michael James Ellis Bennett and I live in Warrington, England. Great podcast. I started with the first volume about 4 years ago and I listened to at least one episode a week. I know I'm not a member of the Illuminati, but I'm giving it serious thought and making a financial contribution to the podcast. I wondered if you were willing to write an alternate history of a part of history that could have happened differently than it did, such as the Second World War, for example. It would be interesting for you to deviate from any timeline and give the account of what would have happened, as some parts of history could have played out differently. Thank you for considering this idea." Michael, it's a wonderful idea. It's a really fascinating idea, and it reminds me somewhat of one or two book of zines which are out there. I think maybe called What If. There's a few of them now, What Ifs, that give you alternate timelines of history if something had not happened. So, for example, if JFK hadn't have been assassinated, what would the immediate years after Kennedy's assassination have looked like had he not been? And a great many different scenarios are explored with alternate timelines. And yes, maybe that's something we could look at in the future. At the moment, though, obviously we're concentrating on the project at hand, which is getting through this period from 1450 to 1750. So I don't envisage it's in the immediate future, but it's a great idea and something maybe that we can consider sometime down the line. So thank you so much for a wonderful suggestion. Melinda Velasquez has written in and said, "I'm so glad I found your podcast. Thank you for all of your hard work. I've only just finished the first 2 volumes, but I can't wait to hear more. I've always loved history, but had never heard of Göbekli Tepe until you mentioned it. And I just watched a Nova episode on PBS all about it called Stone Age Temple Mystery. I don't know if you would be able to access it in the UK, but it was an excellent documentary about what it is, the people, the story of the archaeology, what's happened to the people and how it changes what we know about the timeline of development of farming. Definitely a must watch if possible. Also, have you read the research on very early breadcrumbs found in northern Jordan from a paper in 2018? Thank you for deepening my knowledge of history. Now, Melinda, I've got to be honest, I don't really know a lot about it, but I have done a little bit of research, and it appears that archaeologists discovered some charred crumbs of bread-like produce that dated to over 14,000 years ago. So what that tells us is that people may have been producing a kind of bread before the agricultural revolution, and the implications of that are quite considerable. If hunter-gatherers were producing a kind of bread, then it demonstrates maybe a leaning towards cereal products, and maybe before it was fully domesticated. So it's a really interesting discovery that warrants more attention. So thank you, Melinda. A really fascinating an insightful email. So that brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to round off this week with an email from Chris Hasler, who's put, "Hey Chris, just a quick note to say I've been enjoying your writings and work. You do the name proud, sir. Keep it up. Sincerely yours, Chris Hasler, Halifax, Nova Scotia." Well, I'll tell you what, Chris, there's not many of us around. This surname is quite a rare surname. So to find a fellow Hasler is always a pleasure, but to find a fellow Chris Hasler is something quite special. Maybe we could search the globe for other Chris Haslers and maybe have a Chris Hasler convention somewhere or other in the world sometime in the future. But I really appreciate you getting in touch, Chris, and I'm thrilled to hear you enjoying the work. So to find another Chris Hasler with a passion for history also, well, that is quite a special thing indeed. Anyway, that's it for this week. The next episode will be the remainder of the Ottoman story throughout this particular period, of the 1450 to 1750, this sort of strange period between medieval and industrial Europe. So I look forward to hooking up with you again next time. But of course, until then, be good.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
Traditional banks are making it harder than ever to secure a small business loan. That's why thousands of business owners trust Cardiff for same-day funding. With over 2 decades of expertise, business owners keep voting Cardiff America's favorite small business lender. Apply now for up to $500,000 in same-day business funding at cardiff.co/Spotify. Again, that's cardiff.co/Spotify. Cardiff. Borrow better.
Still waiting in line? Again? That's time you'll never get back. Save time and money with Stamps.com. Over 4 million businesses have skipped the line with Stamps.com. Join them to save up to 90% off carrier rates from your computer or phone right now. Print postage for certified mail, registered mail, and packages in seconds. Then schedule a pickup right from your home or office. For a limited time, go to Stamps.com and use code PODCAST for a free welcome gift. Taxes and fees apply.
Are you enjoying the History of the World podcast? If so, visit historyoftheworldpodcast.com, click on the Patreon link, and sign up to make a monthly contribution. Follow the History of the World podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X, Threads, Tumblr, and Mastodon. And don't forget to look out for our sister podcast, History of the World Podcast Timelines. Thanks for listening.